Well, today is May 5th, or as it is known more commonly on college campuses and among tequila and beer enthusiasts of all ages, Cinco de Mayo, which has carried with it the implication that the 5th of May is either Mexican Independence Day or some holiday of some great significance on the south side of Trump's imaginary wall. But it's not. Pretty much it's a cultural appropriation, but around here, any attention given to Latino culture is sometimes just taken with a grain of salt or a salt rim, something, salt. Mexican Independence Day is actually September 16th, Diez y Seis, and that is a day typically ignored around here unless Andrew Hernandez once again tries to make me go out and eat menudo, which will not happen again this year. Some holidays are seriously intended to help us remember significant historical events, and others are purely frivolous or even manipulative, like Valentine's Day or other greeting card holidays. But this week, in 66 nations around the world, May Day was observed as an international holiday recognizing both the labor of workers and celebrations of workers' rights, particularly as they have been earned by labor unions and through collective action, strikes, protests, and sometimes riots. As noted in our wisdom lesson today, May Day is not an official holiday in the United States because it was too closely associated with communism. So in an effort to hide May Day observances, President Eisenhower declared May 1st to be Law Day, which was meant to stress our American value for following the laws rather than having strikes and riots, such as the Haymarket incident that had created May Day. To the best of my knowledge, Law Day is not actually celebrated anywhere except for Drury University right here in Springfield. About 20 years ago, the president at Drury called me and asked me if I would say the invocation at their Law Day observance and share the platform with Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. Dr. Moore was shocked that I declined to be a part of that event, and he assured me that it would be a huge honor and a real feather in my hat to be seen with a Supreme Court justice. I thanked him and I assured him, well, I probably shouldn't tell you what I assured him. You all kind of want to know, don't you? I told him I was sure he could find some ordained whore that would do it. And I believe it was a local Methodist pastor that took my place. But I digress. Let me remind you of how May Day became important as a labor observance. In the early stages of the American Industrial Revolution, as factories were built up and workers were taken out of agriculture and home manufacturing to work in the factories, they fell into a 6-day-a-week, 60-hour work week. Strikes and riots were taking place all across the United States in 1886, demanding an 8-hour workday, and a 5-day work week was in there. Gunfire was exchanged between striking workers and the police in Chicago, and eventually a bomb was thrown that killed a dozen people, many of whom were police, and dozens of others were seriously wounded. In reaction to the riot, the government of Chicago arrested 8 labor union activists, most of whom had nothing to do with the bombing. And yet, one of them committed suicide in jail, another 4 were hanged before the Illinois governor stepped in and commuted the sentences of the survivors because the trial had been a hoax. The most famous image used in the media at the time was this one, depicting the bomb going off just as the Reverend Samuel Fielding, an anarchist and a Methodist pastor, was finishing his speech to the striking workers. Apparently, in the 19th century, Methodists were a lot more liberal and progressive than they are now. The Haymarket Riot created martyrs for the labor movement, and though the event took place in Chicago, it became the rallying anniversary for workers throughout the world, everywhere, in essence, except for the United States. And it never caught on here because of the American resistance to unions and labor activism. Our fall observance of Labor Day, which was offered in the years following the Haymarket Riot, was intended to be a more peaceful alternative, tipping a hat to labor, but hoping for parades and cookouts rather than riots. Sadly, it has worked pretty well. Regardless of what was declared by the Citizens United decision of the Supreme Court, corporations are not people. Corporations do not feel compassion. Corporations don't have your best interests at heart. Corporations are not inherently concerned about the environment, or about human rights, or living conditions, or even the survival of the species beyond the desirability of the species to spend money and create profits. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, freedom was never voluntarily granted by the oppressor. Now, I don't want this to slip by us. King says freedom was never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Think about it. Ben Franklin was opposed to slavery, but he did not free his slaves during his lifetime. Thomas Jefferson was opposed to slavery, but he did not free his slaves during his lifetime. George Washington was opposed to slavery, but he did not free his slaves during his lifetime. The founder of our former denomination, Bill, Alexander Campbell, was an anti-slavery delegate to the Virginia legislature, and he did not free his slaves until the end of his lifetime. It is not that we hate corporations and employers. It is that we understand that those who are in power, the people who own the assets and control labor, whether it's financial or human capital, they will not voluntarily give up their wealth or power unless they have to. And when we talk about Law Day as an alternative to May Day, you have to understand that the laws are written by and for the wealthy. The poor are not invited to help write the laws. The poor, the workers, the middle class, then are left to collective bargaining, primarily through unions, or the wage gap that threatens to destroy both capitalism and democracy will eventually bring our nation to its knees. Labor unions exist not because we hate corporations or because corporations are inherently evil, but because employers are always looking to lower the cost of production. That increases profits. They then need to have a united front on the side of labor to force them to treat workers well. It just keeps them honest. They need a strong collective union to negotiate with labor. The work week did not go from 60 hours and a 6-day week to 40 hours and a 5-day week because employers started feeling generous. So there has been a concerted effort on the part of employers, supported by the courts and the government, to drive down union membership. And as you can see, they've been very, very effective, going from 32% around the time of World War II down to below 12% now. As you can see, union membership has been in a deep dive for most of a century, and therefore it should not come as a surprise that as collective bargaining and union negotiation has diminished, income has separated so that the majority of every bit of new capital created goes to the top 1%. Income disparity in the United States will destroy capitalism. They keep asking political candidates, are you a capitalist? And they hedge and well, if you ask me, yeah, I believe in capitalism in a certain way, but it's got to have guardrails. It's got to have a logical kind of regulation, or it will destroy the country. It will not change when the 1% wakes up and says, hey guys, we can't keep taking 88 cents out of every dollar earned in America and expect this to last forever. Look, folks, we have enough money to make college tuition free, to make health care universal. We have enough money to take care of the housing needs and nutrition needs of everyone in America. What we don't have is enough money to satisfy the greed of the 1%. Amen. What I don't understand is why we keep trying. It's just they don't need it. Now, I spoke last week a bit about how our government and corporations are trying to stoke up fear of socialism, which is why the corporate-owned media, will almost never say anything good about Bernie Sanders or about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and why most Democratic candidates act like they don't understand the question when they are asked if they are a capitalist or not, as if they didn't know what the difference was between democratic socialism and socialism. Our economic system, and it's not going too far to say that it's either fascist or it's right next to being that, depends upon a constant stream of dishonest propaganda. Because if the people of the country ever woke up and became aware, once the powerless, the poor, the workers became aware and united, then the capture of 88 cents out of every dollar by the top 1% would come to an end. Former Secretary of Labor, economist Robert Reich, pointed out that as much as conservatives use the denunciation of socialism as a scare word for their base, the fact is that America already practices socialism for the rich, and capitalism is reserved for the vulnerable and the poor. For example, during Trump's time in office, General Motors has been given $600 million in federal contracts while receiving $500 million in tax breaks. While employees suffer the brunt of capitalism when, by the end of this year, they will lay off more than 14,000 employees. If you are a salaried employee, you are subjected to the rules of capitalism. If you're at the top of the pile, you are simply able to rake off all of the fat of the land. The laying off of 14,000 employees is being rewarded with a $50 million bonus for General Motors' CEO. Wall Street banks receive more than $80 billion in subsidies. They're secretive and they're difficult to discern, but Wall Street banks get $80 billion in subsidies, of which more than $30 billion of that is set aside for bonuses for executives, all while their employees are subjected to layoffs and wage freezes. So who's scared of socialism now? Not CEOs, not the executives in the banking industry or the automotive industry, and certainly not in the military-industrial complex. And at this point in history, about 60% of the wealth in America is simply inherited. You know, you hear people saying, well, this is my money, I earned it. Well, the majority of America's wealth was not earned by the people that have it. They inherited it, many of them without having worked a single day in their lives. Even those who have amassed a great fortune through ingenuity and invention. And you think of Bill Gates, but he did not become wealthy just because of the genius of Microsoft. It took a favorable tax structure and very favorable copyright laws to make him the richest or one of the 2 or 3 richest people in the world. We all agree that hard work and ingenuity deserves reward, but do they deserve being elevated to the status of godlike oligarch? The Trump administration's dismantling of EPA regulations, deregulating banks and investment houses, and relaxing regulations on industry all happen under the cover of more salacious stories about their family's intrigue and about affairs and porn stars and all the bluster of tweeting. But the true damage is hardly covered by the news. The real damage is happening with the tax cuts, deregulation, and benefits contracts being given to the few. Now, Washington Post headlines this week declared that Trump passed a new milestone in his administration, having publicly told more than 10,000 lies since taking office. It reminds me of my grad school training and working with families of alcoholics and addicts. You believe the lies because it's better than having to face the truth. He tells lies to the poor and the middle class about tax cuts, about jobs saved, about crime, about the wall, about climate change, and about Russia not helping him win in 2016, and that he's not really holding the door open to Russia in 2020. The simple among us, and I'm sorry to use a pejorative term, but the simple among us, in desperation, believe the lies. Those of us who are aware that he's nearly always lying, we get tired, don't we? We just get tired. And in hopelessness, we stop paying attention. I have friends, smart, educated, aware friends, who are nearly bragging when they say that they don't watch the news anymore. They wear their refusal to read newspapers as if it were an accomplishment to be uninformed. They don't want to waste energy on a hopeless situation. They want to be happy. They want to enjoy life. Who can blame them for that? But in the process, they are literally turning the reins of the world's greatest democracy over to a tyrant and a fascist, as if they were powerless to do anything about it. Now, there's a lot to be wary about from the comedian and commentator Lee Camp. I still listen to some of his stuff. But ever since he started hosting a show on Russian television, I've been less interested in him. But I'm going to repeat today, as the conclusion of my sermon, his ending advice that he uses on all of his shows. And it is this: stay angry, my friends.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.